Do you ever ask yourself whether there is a common set of civic virtues in the United States, or whether there should be? I do. I've been reading an updated edition of Michael Sandel's Democracy's Discontent, and I learned something fascinating about the history of civic virtue in our country. According to Sandel's read of our history, and by the way, it's a very well supported read, prior to about 1900, a major stated reason for almost every national and local government policy was the intentional development of a common civic virtue. Developing that virtue was seen as a primary role of government at all levels. More importantly, it was understood that this virtue needed to be commonly shared across all our people. Since then, civic virtue has essentially disappeared as a recognized role of government. It was gradually replaced by a more progressive role, assuring personal wealth and welfare. A shift embraced by both the left and the right. And also, it has to be said that at the turn of that century, from the 19th to the 20th, the common agreement was largely enforced by a dominant cultural majority, often excluding women, minority groups, and non-Protestant immigrants. Here's my takeaway. For roughly the first half of our nation's history, we the people were actively involved through our representatives in defining and developing our common civic virtues. Then, for the first half of the last 125 years, sustaining civic virtue was left to public schools and the private sector. It became less common and increasingly local in nature. For the past 60 years, however, civic virtue has been left strictly to the private sector. Starting in the 1960s, public schools, as agents of the government, were largely stripped of this role due to various legal and cultural shifts, like removing prayer from schools and navigating new diversity mandates. People started doubting whether civic virtue should even be common, as shared virtues were increasingly viewed as inherently oppressive. For a while, the private sector picked up the slack through churches, the Scouts, benevolent societies, and trade groups like unions and guilds, but participation in those organizations has been dwindling for the past 30 years. That meant developing civic virtue fell almost entirely to individual families, making it anything but common. And today, as families face increasing strain and the traditional role of parenting has been dialed back, even that anchor is slipping. So here we are. Developing civic virtue is now an individual job, if and when we ever get around to it. There's no one left to hand the job off to. And there is absolutely nothing common about it anymore. See, we are in the middle of a grand experiment. Postmodern individuals attempting to craft their own individually defined Civic Virtues. You think there's room for conflict here? Remember, common civic virtues are still required if you want to build families, communities, and self-governing societies. That need was clearly understood through the Enlightenment and by our founders, as proven by our first 120 years. Where we go from here ultimately can be resolved only in one of two ways. Option one, we give up on the experiment of self-government and succumb to autocracy, whether that takes the form of a monarchy, an oligarchy, or a bureaucracy. Option two, we engage on the topic of civic virtues through our elected representatives. Now that second option will be hard. What we could agree on today looks vastly different from what was implicitly agreed upon before 1900. Now, our shift toward pluralism in the 1960s and continuing today wasn't necessarily a rejection of virtues. It has to be seen as an effort to ensure civic virtues aren't defined so narrowly that they become an excuse for exclusion. So it would have to be a foundational, stripped down set of core values to gain agreement across our diverse population. Personally, I favor that second path. I want my voice heard in something this consequential. But I'm constantly reminded of Lincoln's warning about a house divided. It's great to be old. This, I believe. Aloha.